We're not trying to fool anybody, sir. It's 2 bills, 1 budget. We're working with OMB, and we feel very comfortable with the number of $961 billion.
Why don't you give us a straight-up budget for the Defense Department?
Senator Angus King presses Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on 2 core issues: the decision to restore Confederate-era base names and the administration's choice to present the defense budget in a divided and unconventional format. King questions both the moral reasoning behind honoring figures who fought against the United States and the transparency of a budgeting strategy that places major defense funding into partisan reconciliation, rather than the traditional bipartisan process.
Mr. Secretary, I'm somewhat puzzled. I grew up in Virginia, where Robert E. Lee was revered. I think when I was a kid, his birthday was a school holiday. But as I grew older and learned more about American history, I learned that he fit the classic definition of a traitor. He took up arms against his country. He broke his oath as a member of the United States Army, which he took upon entering his career at West Point. Why are you going through these incredible gymnastics, finding current soldiers or other soldiers to rename? And you slipped a minute ago. You said we're returning these bases to their original names. Robert E. Lee, leading general of the Confederacy, Pickett, the other names. Why are you doing this? I don't understand what the motivation is to rename bases for people who took up arms against their country on behalf of slavery. What possible motivation can there be for this? Who is telling you to do this? Who is urging you to do this?
Senator, the veterans and service members across the country who have deployed from Fort Bragg or Fort Benning or Fort Hood or Fort Pickett, there's a legacy, there's a connection to those bases and to those places, to what they trained for there, what they did for, and what they came home back to. That matters to them. Ask enough of us. I do all the time, before and later. And we recognize the service of those who were put into the replacement. No one's disputing that. I would never dispute that. What we're looking at is erasing history, erasing names, erasing base names that service members are tied to. Talk to people that serve at Bragg. Ask people that serve at Fort Bragg or Fort Benning if they like the fact that the names have been returned. And to a man and to a woman, they will tell you, thank God we're back to Fort Bragg, and thank God we're back. And thankfully, because so many men and women in this country have served, there's a Benning and a Bragg and a Pickett and a Hood that has a Silver Star or a Medal of Honor that we could rename the base to because of the limits of what Congress allowed us to do. So this is something we've been proud to do, something that's important for the morale of the Army, and those communities appreciate that we've returned it back to what it was instead of trying to play this game of erasing names.
We're not erasing history, Mr. Secretary. We're recognizing history and recognizing that mistakes have been made in this country. The greatest of all was the Civil War, where people took up arms against their country on behalf of the institution of slavery. And to continue the practice of recognizing those people and honoring them by the naming of these bases is, I believe, an insult to the people of the United States. Let me talk about the budget. I don't understand why the budget is coming to us in 2 pieces. Why not give us an honest base budget instead of putting a piece of it in reconciliation? As I understand it, OMB is saying we're going to have a flat defense budget for the next 4 or 5 years. Are we planning reconciliation every year from now on? Why not give us an honest budget telling us what your priorities are, and then we can consider it. This committee always works in a bipartisan basis on a defense budget. We all want to see some increases in the defense budget, and yet you're giving us this this fake, here's a piece of the budget, here's another. You're cutting in the base budget, you're cutting shipbuilding in half and saying, well, we're going to make it up in reconciliation. Are we going to have reconciliation every year, which basically, by the way, puts a significant part, 10 or 15% of the defense budget in a wholly partisan decision-making process, whereas in the history of this committee, it's always been bipartisan. Why are we doing it this way?
Senator, from our view, the budget number 961 meets the requirements and threats that we face. And
That's not the number. The number is 892.6. You're
view-
adding reconciliation. That's my whole point. Why not give us a base budget of 961 or whatever the right number is, what you consider the right number, and then we can operate and make our decisions. Why do it in this bifurcated way that really is fooling the American people about what the defense budget is?
We're not trying to fool anybody, sir. It's two bills, one budget.
Haven't asked my
We're
question
working
yet.
with
Why is it-
OMB,
why is it
and
being
we
done
feel
this
very
way?
comfortable
Why
with
is it
the
being
number of
done this way?
961 billion.
Why don't you give us a straight up budget for the Defense Department? That's my question.
Senator, this is a straight up budget for the Defense Department. And it's a
It
13%
is not.
increase over what Joe
It
Biden
is
gave
a
us.
two-part defense budget. Part of it is in reconciliation instead of in the budget that's being presented to this committee. This committee only has a partial review of the budget. I don't understand why we can't have an honest, straightforward budget instead of this son of Oko that you're putting over on us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Angus King's exchange with Pete Hegseth centers on two fundamental responsibilities of civilian defense leadership: how the nation chooses to remember its history, and how it honestly accounts for its military priorities. On both fronts, King raises concerns that go beyond symbolism or accounting mechanics, and instead speak to judgment, transparency, and trust between the Department of Defense and Congress. On the issue of restoring Confederate-era base names, King reframes the debate away from nostalgia or tradition and toward constitutional loyalty. His argument is direct. Robert E. Lee and other Confederate leaders were not merely historical figures, but officers who broke their oath to the United States and took up arms in defense of slavery. By returning base names associated with the Confederacy, King argues that the Department of Defense is continuing a practice of honoring individuals who fought against the nation itself. In this framing, the issue is not whether service members feel personal attachment to base names, but whether the U.S. military should institutionalize honor for those who actively sought the country's destruction. Hegseth's response emphasizes morale, tradition, and the emotional connection service members feel to long-standing base names. He argues that restoring names is about continuity rather than ideology, and rejects the idea that doing so erases or diminishes the service of the individuals who were honored during the renaming process. However, this defense avoids the central question King repeatedly presses: why preserving attachment to Confederate-associated names should outweigh the moral and historical reality of what those names represent. The exchange highlights a philosophical divide between viewing military history as neutral tradition versus recognizing it as an evolving reflection of national values and constitutional principles. King's critique also exposes a broader concern about historical accountability. He explicitly rejects the idea that removing Confederate names erases history, arguing instead that history is acknowledged by recognizing past mistakes rather than continuing to honor them. This approach aligns with a long-standing view that public honors are not passive records of the past, but active statements about what a nation chooses to celebrate. Hegseth's refusal to engage directly with this premise leaves unresolved whether the Department of Defense is prioritizing institutional comfort over ethical clarity. The second half of the exchange shifts to defense budgeting, where King challenges the administration's decision to present the defense budget in two parts, one through the base budget and another through reconciliation. King's concern is not simply procedural. He argues that splitting the budget obscures the true size of defense spending, limits congressional oversight, and shifts a significant portion of national defense funding into a partisan process that historically has been bipartisan. By doing so, Congress is asked to evaluate defense priorities without seeing the full financial picture at once. Hegseth insists that the administration is presenting a single defense budget spread across two legislative vehicles and denies any intent to mislead. King counters that intent is beside the point. The effect is reduced transparency. When shipbuilding is cut in the base budget with the promise of restoration through reconciliation, lawmakers are left evaluating defense readiness on incomplete information. This structure, King argues, undermines the Armed Services Committee's ability to conduct serious, bipartisan oversight and risks normalizing a process where large portions of defense funding depend on partisan outcomes. Taken together, but without relying on rhetorical shortcuts, the exchange reveals a consistent pattern. On both historical commemoration and budget transparency, King challenges Hegseth to explain why choices that increase division and ambiguity are preferable to approaches grounded in clarity, accountability, and constitutional principle. Hegseth's answers rely heavily on assertions of morale, tradition, and process compliance, but they leave unanswered questions about ethical responsibility and honest governance. For critics, This exchange reinforces concerns that decisions under Hegseth's leadership prioritize symbolism and political alignment over institutional integrity and congressional trust. For supporters, it reflects a belief that restoring tradition and aggressively pursuing funding increases justify unconventional methods. What remains clear is that Senator King's questioning exposes unresolved tensions about how the Department of Defense balances history, transparency, and democratic oversight at a time when public confidence in institutions is already strained.